Well, welcome to the Cinnabar. Now, today's episode might not be the most exciting we've made, but for those of you who are like me and like to turn screws on these vintage firearms, this one might be the most useful. See, today we're going to talk about the Gunsmith Scourge, the stuck gun screw. And we'll take you through my process and progression for how I go after these little devils. Now, I think I've got an excellent example here of a screw that's not going to give it up easily. You see this slide cover screw on this 1890 Winchester receiver. This receiver's just been badly rusted and pitted and cleaned up in the past, and we can see that somebody's tried to get this screw out in the past because there's little grooves or notches on the receiver on both ends of the screw slot. Now, one of the first things we have to learn is when to have the wherewithal to give up, set our screwdriver down, and go to the next step before we mess something up really badly. I think we've all seen nice guns that right off the end of the screw slot there's just a big gouge running down the receivers, and the only way we really learn when to give up and go to the next step is by messing up and going too far, and we hope that we do that on a receiver like this and not some high condition firearm or a family heirloom or whatnot. So always err to the side of caution. If you come to a screw that's not coming out real easily, don't get frustrated and go too far and mess things up. Set your screwdriver down and go to the next step. So let's talk about what the next step's going to be. Now, the very next step is to put a good quality penetrating oil on this screw. And I use this Kroil. You know, it's not a paid endorsement, but I've just had really good luck with this stuff. Now, I put some Kroil on this, it's been a couple of days ago now. Typically, in my experience, it doesn't take nearly that long. It really penetrates well, and usually after a few hours, if I can get a screw out or a barrel off, the threads are completely soaked and wet with Kroil. So that's great stuff. Next thing, it's really handy to know what you're up against as far as the screw itself. Now, if we look at this screw head on here, it's a pretty good sized screw, or it looks like it, but the reality is that it's actually got a pretty large head, but the screw itself is very small. Has a small diameter, it's short, and that's really good information to have, especially if we get to the point where we've got to drill this thing out, because we certainly need to get it centered really well and not get into those threads. Now, the next thing we really want to know is whether that screw goes all the way through or not, and there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, if it goes all the way through, then it's going to be a lot easier to get our penetrating oil on the back side and directly into the threads. If otherwise, we've got to get that penetrating oil around the head of that screw and into the threads, and that's a lot more difficult for it to get and a tougher path. The other reason is we want to look at the back side of that screw, the end of that, if it goes all the way through, and make sure that it's not damaged. And a perfect example of that, if any of you have worked on these toggle link Winchesters, in this case a first model 1873, we've got the side plates put on with a screw that goes from the left hand side, and then the end of it comes out on this right hand side plate. And I've seen several of them over the years that screw is just slightly too long, or the end of that screw. And what happens is as it's been used and abused over the years, it peens that over, mushrooms the end of that screw, and then it is a bugger to get out because now it's a larger diameter than the screw hole. And that's a whole episode on itself, as how to get that out without damaging the side plates. Okay, so we've got to the point now we know what we're up against, and so let's see what the next step is for going after the screw. Now, the next thing we want to do is check out this screw slot, and this one really isn't all that bad, but we've all seen the ones that are really opened up, and we've got a lot of the metal pushed up off of the edges of the slots, and we really want to save that metal. The last thing we want to do is to try to clean that metal off and lose it. You know, these older guns, the steel is pretty soft. Even on the receivers and the barrels, we can move that metal around and try to salvage it. And we always want to salvage as much of the metal as possible. Move it before you remove it. Okay, so typically what we do, like when this screw is out, we move metal with a 3 or 4 ounce ball peen hammer with a polished face. We want to polish that face really good because any dings in it are going to transfer to whatever metal we're trying to move. Now, in this case, it'd be really hard if the edges were all pushed up to hit it with this hammer and not leave elephant tracks all over our receiver here. So instead of doing that, we can do that after it's out. We're going to go ahead and polish up the tip of a punch here and use it to close up that slot again and push that metal back in. Now this one really doesn't need it, but just we can push a little bit of that edge that's pushed up just with this punch and a gunsmith hammer. And it'll go a long ways towards getting that slot looking a whole bunch better. Now if it's really dished out, sometimes we'll try with the end of a slot file or a needle file to kind of clean that up, but it's really difficult to do, and you really run the risk if you've got a nice receiver of getting out here and putting scratches in your receiver. So I try to leave that alone and just push metal with that punch. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is find a tip or a screwdriver that fits this slot really well. So we want this tip or the screwdriver to be full length and full width. Now this one's just a little bit thicker or wider than the slot, and that's okay. If it's just a tiny bit, then we can tap it down in there. And that gives us the extra benefit of the vibration from that tapping. It hopefully is breaking some of those bonds, that rust that's in there in the threads as well. So we've got the coil soaked in there, we're tapping and breaking some of those bonds, and then we can put our screwdriver on. And the nice thing about these kind of tips is that we can put a little wrench on there and get a little extra torque when we go to turn this thing. Okay, so now our next step is we've got everything set up here. We want to put some heat in here. Heat goes a long ways towards breaking those rust bonds. So we're going to just grab a heat gun here. You know, a hair dryer works for this situation. We're not going to put a whole bunch of heat into it. Just enough that we can't just hold our hand on it. So we'll take just a little bit here to heat it up. A little more. Okay. Now we're gonna set this over here. Get our screwdriver in. Tap it down into place. Get our wrench on it and see if we can't turn this thing. And as I suspected, it's not going to go. This one's really in there. 9 times out of 10, this will get any screw out that I've ever come across. But this isn't just your average stuck screw. Nope. So, on to the next step. Okay, so now we're calling in the big guns. We're over here at the drill press. We've got our receiver here in the vise. We've got a screwdriver tip that's out of one of those replaceable sets. It's kind of a cheap one, so I'm hoping it'll stand up to the pressure. We've got it ground to where it fits the slot in this screw really well. And then we just turned a little handle here to where the tip of it fits right in the chuck here. And that's going to give us some ability to torque on this while we're holding down with good pressure with the drill press. So let's get in a little bit closer and I'll show you how this all works. Alright, so we've put a little more heat into it. We'll get this screwdriver right into the slot. Good. Now we've got good down pressure. Let's see if we can get this thing to break loose. I see my cheap screwdriver is flexing quite a bit. I don't think it's up to the task. We may have to go find something else. Yeah, we're putting about as much pressure on it as we possibly can, but it's just twisting this cheap screwdriver. Now obviously this method gives us some good torque. You can see what it did to this screwdriver. So we've got another tip here that looks like it's going to fit really well. Let's give it a try real quick. Boy, this screw really doesn't want to give it up. There it goes. We got it. I was just about to give up when it broke loose. That's pretty amazing. Boy, there's a lot of rust coming up out of those threads. But we did manage to save that little devil. Now, really, if we hadn't been able to get it out with that drill press method, our only option available to us then would be to try to drill it out and easy out it. But on a small diameter screw like that, that's really difficult to save the threads. Most likely we'd have to drill it oversized, retap it, and then make a custom screw to go in its place. But I think, you know, as long as you can get a good bite on that screw head, that drill press method is going to work 99% of the time. And I have to admit that this trick was taught to me by a master gunsmith friend of mine the last time I visited him, and I was just amazed at how well it did work. So this is my first try with it on a really tough screw, and it really did the job. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I hope you learned something. Until next time, happy trails from the Cinnabar.